This is the iPad 3, and it's possibly one of the strangest devices Apple's ever released. From its release in early 2012, it already had a successor by December of the same year. But what happened here, and why is this often considered one of the worst iPads ever to exist? Here's the thing, the iPad 3 had to replace what was already a great product, the iPad 2. The iPad 2 succeeded the original iPad, and it did so spectacularly. It only had one generation of CPU newer, but it was dual-core, which meant it was twice as fast. And it got 4 more iOS updates than the original did, going from iOS 5 all the way up to iOS 9. It was also a much thinner and lighter device, which made it much easier to hold, and it just looked more modern and premium in general. So what Apple did with the iPad 3 seemed obvious. First, they gave it a beautiful 9.7-inch Retina display, spanning well over Full HD resolution, which is a giant upgrade over the frankly ancient resolution of 1024 by 768. And on paper, the iPad 3 seemed like a solid upgrade over the 2. It had the faster A5X processor and apparently double the graphics power. It also had double the RAM, a gigabyte over 512 megabytes, and this was the first iPad to feature LTE connectivity. In addition, it had a better back camera and a better build quality in general. So you'd probably think that this exceeded the iPad 2 massively, but it's not quite like that. You see, to discuss the iPad 3, we have to look at Apple's lineup at the same time. The iPhone 4S had just launched a couple months before, and it was at the absolute top. It solved many of the issues that the original 4 had, like the antenna gate issue it was well known for, and the slower than expected performance that the A4 chip provided. The A5 was arguably one of the biggest leaps in performance that Apple ever did, adding dual-core functionality to iOS devices for the very first time. And for 2011, the iPad 2 was a beast. With its A5 processor, it could run games at almost 60 frames per second on its fairly low-resolution display. The real problem came though when that chip aged. For as fast as the A5 was at its time, technology is always moving forward. And it seemed like this clashed for a deadline for a release date. Because instead of featuring an A6 processor, the iPad 3 featured an A5X processor, which on paper seemed like a pretty solid upgrade over the regular A5. I mean, it had 4 times the graphical power apparently with a 4-core GPU, and the CPU was theoretically a beast. I mean, seriously, if you look up a picture of the die of the A5X, it's absolutely huge for any mobile device, and even required a metal heat spreader to dissipate all that heat. But this was mainly because it was being manufactured at the bigger 45nm process instead of the upcoming 32nm process. And this is really unfortunate when you consider that they were probably just trying to get way too much performance out of the A5 when it simply wasn't really possible. Because the A6X, which came in the next iPad, was on the 32nm process and ran cooler while providing over double the performance. And the real problem with the A5X is that although they apparently doubled the graphics output, they were driving 4 times as many pixels here. They literally doubled the vertical resolutions of 1024 by 768. It's kind of equivalent to your PC that can run games at 1080p, not being able to run games at 4K so well. This led to the iPad 3 actually performing worse than the iPad 2 in later iOS updates. I think this issue got so bad that they immediately got worse in the next model, which is why they released iPad 4 so early, and on a completely unrelated time schedule when they normally do it. And in my opinion, they really should have just skipped this thing entirely and released the 4th gen as simply the 3rd gen. And in fact, I think Apple was so embarrassed to release this thing that the 4th gen was marketed as the iPad with Retina display, despite the fact that this thing is in fact the iPad with Retina display. Maybe they should have called it something like the iPad with Lightning port, because this thing was the last device to ever feature a 30-pin connector. Or maybe the iPad with a kind of good processor this time. So understandably, consumers were upset that their device that not only took forever to ship because of all the high pre-orders, was outdated by the time they got it into Christmas. And because of this, Apple actually extended the 30-day return program for people who bought the iPad 3, only to have it replaced within a month by the iPad 4. And this is probably why, despite the very high pre-orders and general excitement about this iPad, it doesn't have nearly as much fanfare in Apple communities today. It was a very disappointing upgrade compared to what the iPad 2 managed to do to the first generation in comparison. Now, let's look at the iPad itself. A question you might be asking me is, why did I buy one of these in 2022, even just for review? Well, I didn't. I was gifted this back in 2015 by my parents, thank you Mom and Dad, and we've had these around for a long time, to say the least. Mine and my brother's are long gone, but this one is the only one that's actually managed to stay around. But one of the problems I encountered with this thing is that the 30-pin charging port connector is starting to go out, and I only managed to get this thing charged up once. And yes, I'm doing this entire video on a single charge of the iPad 3, so you can rest assured that the iPad battery life is pretty good. But this thing hasn't been used in years, frankly, and from the second it booted up, I remember why we stopped using them. Even typing in my PIN passcode felt like a nauseating experience. I literally couldn't imagine a slower experience, aside from maybe my Samsung Galaxy J3 I had for quite some time. Now, onto real-world use. Because usable is not a word I use to describe this iPad anymore, and it's going to be a word less used to describe this iPad as time goes on. The latest supported operating system is iOS 9 from 2015, which was like 4 years ago, and... Wait a minute. Oh, that can't be right, that can't be right. How long ago was the year 2016?
It was 5 years ago.
You're kidding me. I'm getting old. Anyways, after I get over my existential crisis, yeah, this thing hasn't had an iOS update in over 6 years. Anyways, it last got updated in 2016 with iOS 9.3.5, and I'd say that it was last really usable in about 2018 or so. From there, support's been dropping for this frankly ancient operating system, and I can't blame them. To be clear, you can still find old apps from like 2014 in the Play Store, and you can install them just fine. And if you have older apps that you've downloaded in your app library, you can download the latest version that's compatible with them, but newer apps, for example, like TikTok, simply just don't even work with this anymore. And most of the apps that you want to use on this thing, like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they just simply don't work anymore. And yes, you can get around this with a web browser, but the thing is that this is Safari from 2015 and it hasn't seen an update in over 8 years, so some of the websites are starting to not look so flashy anymore. And as far as games go, yeah, you can find a lot of the older games, for example, this Bear Simulator game that I had a ton of fun playing with when I was like 12 years old. But the thing is that even historically crazily supported apps like Clash of Clans and Minecraft have recently dropped support for the iPad 3 entirely. It's actually kind of strange too, because you can notice how time moves with a device like this. But the thing is that with iOS, they have all these incremental updates, right? Like, you probably couldn't really tell the difference between iOS 9 and iOS 10, iOS 12 and iOS 13, but all those little improvements combined make up for a really different experience. I mean, seriously, when's the last time you've seen slide to unlock? And this wallpaper in particular. Same with this dock. I mean, we're used to the modern brightness slider that was introduced back in 2018, but this iPad 3 still has the really old one from iOS 7. It really just makes it feel like a whole different era of device. And yeah, people like to complain about the app icons never changing in iOS, but that's not really the point of iOS being iOS. Sure, Android loves to change icons all the time, but that's because every other Android manufacturer is running the same operating system, so they need to make it look different with their own skin. iOS is its own kind of thing, you know? Everything around it is really what counts and makes it different from another version of iOS. However, the biggest complaint about iOS 9 was particularly for the iPad 2, 3, and iPhone 4S. It simply didn't seem to belong on these devices. Because, sure, iOS 8 was kind of slow and it didn't do too well on iOS 7, but iOS 9 really seemed to just put the nail in the coffin for the usability of a device like this. I mean, seriously, loading just about everything takes absolutely ages. Whether you're swiping through the multitasking menu, trying to open an app that you just opened, like seriously, this was open like 5 seconds ago and it's completely unresponsive, you're almost always waiting for the tablet to do anything you ask it to do. The release of iOS 9 on the iPad 3, for many, sealed this fate as a device that would be utterly unusable for the foreseeable future, and was totally not warranting the $500 many people paid for it back in 2012. The A5X chipset wasn't any faster than its A5 counterparts in the real world, and in certain cases it was actually slower. This was combined with the poor efficiency that made this iPad require a gigantic battery. It was actually somehow almost double the size of the iPad 2, yet it retained the same battery life of 10 hours, which, to be clear, this iPad can easily achieve, but it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense how it can be consuming twice as much power. Additionally, because of all the power this thing's consuming, this iPad gets hot, like really hot. Seriously, it made it genuinely uncomfortable to use this iPad in its bare metal form, and it's something that actually annoyed me as a kid when I was using it. This isn't even just some conspiracy either, because tests from back in the day confirmed that there's a 13-degree delta between the iPad 2 and the iPad 3 in temperature, when it was just running the exact same games. This can be somewhat mitigated by putting a case on the iPad, but the problem is that this just traps all the heat inside, which causes the CPU to throttle and makes an already slow device even slower. And the thing is that this thing is just like impossible to have it as a daily driver device at all. I tried to find use cases for this, trust me. I actually tried to type up the script of this thing on the iPad, but the on-screen keyboard was lagging as I was typing. That's a level of slowness I haven't seen in literal years. I tried to use it for music because it does have a headphone jack, but the version of Apple Music on here is so old that it simply doesn't really work anymore. And it's just super slow and laggy. You could literally might as well get an iPod Touch if you want something like that. There's really only one use case I can see this thing being used for, and it's actually its main feature. The Retina display. Seriously, this thing looks great, even today. This was so much sharper than the old iPad 2, and it has well over full HD resolution, which was very important as I mentioned earlier. The only downside is that the screen doesn't get particularly bright, which makes it hard to view outdoors, but if you keep it inside, this thing looks absolutely gorgeous for watching Netflix or YouTube. Of course, the main problem is that you're using an ancient version of YouTube and Netflix, which means a lot of loading and a lot of missing modern features. For example, you can't simply just pinch to zoom the video to fit the aspect ratio of the screen. You have to actually press this button down in the corner. And if the main purpose of a multimedia device like this is for consuming content, then I'd hope it'd load things a little bit faster than this. Our internet's really fast. And while this inbuilt speaker on the iPad 3 actually is pretty good, it's absolutely annihilated by the stereo counterpart like this iPad Mini 6 that I'm using as a teleprompter.
But I can't speak for global engineering.
And so, if you use this thing mainly just for its screen, then this thing ends up being a perfect device for lugging around to the kitchen or the toilet for watching Netflix or really anything else. And if you're fine with using Safari, you can even just prop it like this and scroll Twitter with it. And needless to say, this is a much better experience than you get on most Android tablets for under $100 brand new. I have to make an exception again though, because the truth is, I've been wanting to make this video since 2018, and this was one of the main points I was going to make back then. However, it's 4 years later at this point, and the thing is, a lot of stuff has changed with the tablet market. The reality is that these days you can go on eBay and pick up something like a Samsung Galaxy S2 for under $100 easily, and that has the same resolution and sharpness screen that this thing does, and has way better saturated colors with this AMOLED display. It ends up being just a much better device for watching content. Plus, it has much better community software support, making it a much more wholly usable device in 2022. And now yes, I know, iPad 3s basically go for Pocket Cash these days. But if you have Pocket Cash, then you probably shouldn't spend it on something like this. I'd really recommend just saving up even $20 or $30 more and getting something even remotely better. It just makes no sense to pick up one of these when there's so many great budget options out there today. So this iPad is just an unfortunate failure story, I guess. Even companies like Apple make mistakes. The important thing here is that such a thing never happened again in the iPad lineup, and Apple seemed to learn their lesson. Now they launch products that are unquestionably belonging in the Apple ecosystem and never get replaced immediately by something else. And to a point, I can't really fault Apple a whole lot for what they did here. But the thing is that if you want to keep a customer for life, you have to offer a product that's actually good. And this thing wasn't. So they probably ended up losing a lot of customers that day, which means that they ended up not selling them new products, which loses them money. This led the iPad 3 to age absolutely horribly, being the successor to an already great device while being worse, and then succeeded by an even greater device, ultimately becoming completely insignificant in Apple's history in general. That's probably why, despite this thing selling almost as well as the iPad 2 did, it doesn't have nearly as much fanfare in the Apple community today. And in general, the iPad 3 is just completely obsolete in 2022. But with that said, this is Calc G, out.